Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Nice to see you all. We are back in the Torah. We are back in Leviticus. And last week we took a little break because we were coming up on Purim and we read another of our sacred scriptures, the book of Esther. And it's important to do that. It's important to study that book also. It is also a masterpiece, and um, and uh, we did that because we were leading up to Purim. But I had in mind also. I just want to say that I had in mind that we also were able to do that to sort of, so to speak, take a week off because this week is a lot of what we saw last week in the Torah itself. So we start the book of Leviticus, and the first two parshot, first two readings, are nearly identical. They describe the offerings as they would be brought from the perspective of the person bringing the offering, and then this week we describe really all of those same offerings, but now from the perspective of the priest that would be taking them. So it's mostly the same thing. It's we used to have a joke about this when I was in working at a shul. Like, if you got tapped to speak on Parshat Tzav, you were stuck because it's like there's nothing to talk about. Like it's hard enough to talk about last week's Parsha because it's all the details of the sacrifices, and now we're just basically doing it all over again. So it's like, what do you talk about on Parshat Tzav? In fact, my last sermon at IKAR was on Parshat Tzav, and I felt like, oh, this is fitting. I have to make something of Parshat Tzav. Okay, so all of that is to say that this is difficult stuff, not just because it's repetitive, but also it's difficult stuff to begin with. The sacrifices are difficult, I think, for us, for modern readers, and that's mostly what I want to talk about today is the disconnect that we feel with the sacrifices. And because we have this sort of extra week, so to speak, to reflect on them, what I want to do, I went back and looked at classes I've taught, and I thought, have we ever studied this before, this particular piece from Maimonides on the sacrifices? And I don't think we have in this class before. We have studied many debates between Maimonides, the 11th century, or I want to say 12th century scholar, great, maybe the greatest philosophical thinker in Judaism, a debate between him and his frequent sparring partner, though he didn't know it. It's his sparring partner by way of commenting on him, Nachmanides. We refer to Moses ben Maimon as Maimonides and Moses ben Nachman as Nachmanides. And there you're going to see a very classic, a very important debate between the two of them today. And I hope it'll help us in this extra week that we have to think about the sacrifices, to really think about what do we do with these sacrifices, and how do we relate to them in an age where, and here I come to the point, not only do we not have a temple and sacrifices, that's the rabbi's challenge. So 1/5 of the Torah is no longer relevant. What do we do? 1/5 meaning the book of Leviticus. But I think the other big problem for us is that we don't want sacrifices. Like we have left that period. So it's been such a long time that no longer seems like it no longer seems like a good way to serve God. And it also no longer seems like a good thing to do to animals, right? So there's lots of trouble we have with the sacrifices. And I want today to look at really absolutely one of the classic responses, which will, I think, force some big questions about the entire Torah, right? Which we'll sort of process as we go. We're like, what do we do with the sacrifices? And once you see what Maimonides does the sacrifices, the question becomes, well, can he do that with anything? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's let's take a quick break and say a blessing. I have a couple of announcements. It's really just one. Well, first of all, I try to give the piece that I wrote for Hadar in the chat at the beginning, and here is what I wrote for Hadar, which was all about one notation above one word. And you can see I wrote 10 pages about one notation on one word. So that is, I'm not going to take you through all of that again, but that's if you're interested. And the notation, by the notation, I mean the tam, the cantillation, the trope. And there's a very special trope on one of the words in this week's Parsha. So if you're interested, go take a look at that. And all I can say is the essay that I wrote is related to the class that we're going to do today, in its, but not in all of its details, but just in its. Well, you'll see if you read it. Reflecting on the same questions of what do we do with all these sacrifices? Okay. And the other announcement that I wanted to make, for those of you who are in LA, I wanted to just tell you that we are, Hadar, I am Hadar in LA, and Stiebel, the Stiebel minion, are going to have basically a nigun circle, a sort of song circle, but we're calling it a tish because a tish means table in Yiddish, and there's a tradition, a Hasidic tradition, of gathering on Friday night and sitting around a table and singing together and then learning together a little bit. We're going to do it on Wednesday night. That is in a week, this coming Wednesday, and we're going to do it where Stiebel meets at the Workman's Circle on Robertson, and everybody's welcome to join. It's free, and I should say Antonia Lasser, who some of you know, is going to be leading the singing. She's very skilled at that, and I'm going to be doing a little teaching. So there's an event there, not every Wednesday night, this Wednesday night, and hopefully in my work so far, people are asking me, like, what has Hadar done so far in since you started? And my answer has been, I don't know. I have nothing yet. I'm just getting my sea legs here. But the truth is, what we have done so far is we started a little pop-up Beit Midrash on the east side in Highland Park, which meets on every first Thursday of the month. And I'm excited about that. We've been doing some Beit Midrash learning in San Francisco also. So that's what we've done so far. And now I really want to start something that speaks to another major wing of Hadar's operations, which is its musical wing. And so, and just, not just for Hadar's sake, but because I think Hadar has these spheres of activity, learning and music, because these are really important ways for us to connect together as a Jewish people, as a community, through Torah and through song. I find those to be, those to be essential Jewish practices. So anyway, would love to see you next Wednesday. And with that, let's say a blessing together over our Torah study, and we'll get started today looking at some very important, and I should say, some very difficult material as well. Okay, and I'll warn you as we get to the more and more difficult stuff. One of the cases we'll look at is particularly challenging. Okay, let's say a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. All right, here we go. So we're going to take a look at this piece, as I said, from Maimonides. I'm going to give it to you now, and it's from Maimonides' major philosophical work, the Guide for the Perplexed, and Guide to the Perplexed, Guide for the Perplexed, Mor Nevuchim, it's called. And this is the book that Maimonides is famous for outside of Judaism. This is how Maimonides became a name that you would hear in the halls of philosophy departments. Inside of Judaism, Maimonides is much more famous for his legal work, the Mishneh Torah, his summary, basically, of the entire Talmud. And there's a lot of, I just saw someone talking about this recently. Is the philosophical Maimonides the same as the legalist Maimonides? Not the same person. Everybody agrees the same person. But are they basically two kinds of characters? And one was his sort of worldly character, where he speculated and dealt with ideas that were like non-traditional, and one was his, serious Jewish side moving through the law. And I say that because what he's about to say here in the more philosophical work, more in Nevuchim, about the sacrifices, is something that that might sound like it's coming from outside of the tradition, that it is a kind of a critical almost approach to the tradition. Let me, without talking about it further, show you a little bit what I mean. But he is dealing with, you don't need a whole lot of context here. He's dealing with the sacrifices, and he's dealing with the question of why we have sacrifices. Why do we have sacrifices? And, maybe I should have paused before we even went into the material and just asked you, well, how do you feel about the sacrifices? But I guess I'm not going to do that, because I'm sort of assuming that most of us are not wild about the idea of animal sacrifice. Maybe some of you have a more a deeper, a more sympathetic, a greater appreciation for the sacrifices, and that perspective will also be welcome in this conversation. We will hear some of those voices as well, of those who are defending the sacrifices, but Maimonides is about to say something about them that I think, if you haven't seen it before, has the potential to reshape your whole vision of the Torah. So let's take a look here. And it was a long passage. I started retranslating it, and then I got about halfway through and I got tired of retranslating it. So you may see some archaic language and some he pronouns for God and all that kind of stuff that I usually translate out. But let's take a look here. All right, here we go. Guide for the Perplexed. Okay, and this is in some ways his big principle is his first statement. So I don't know if we're going to read all of this. This is like a lot of material, but the first sentence is enough for us to get the gist of what he is saying and his answer to what the sacrifice is all about. V'hu she'i efshar letzet min hahefech el hahefech pitom. It is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. Okay, this is a human nature thing, which is why I was playing that Michael Jackson song. Human nature. It is therefore, according to the nature of a human, impossible for him to suddenly discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. Now, I just want to say that's a big statement. That's a strong statement. It is impossible for human beings to suddenly go from one extreme to the other. You can't expect that of them. You can't expect that of them. That means you can't just tell people who are doing bad to start doing good. Okay, can't tell people who are worshiping this God to suddenly start worshiping an entirely different entity. Okay, like this is what he's alluding to in the context of the sacrifices, but he just makes this basic statement about human nature. It's impossible to go from one extreme to the other. So I want you already to be thinking, do you agree with Maimonides? Is that true? Is he's going to make a claim? It's impossible for a person to just change, and not just a person, but a nation. So let's see, how does that play into the sacrifices? Well, God sent Moses to make the Israelites a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, okay? We are supposed to be this great, exalted, new form of worship, religion, acknowledgement of the oneness of God. And God is giving us this through Moses. God's giving us a Torah, which gives us the knowledge of God. Now we know that God is one, that God is a singular force, that God created the universe, that there is only one God. And we know that, and now we can stop worshiping all of these silly other deities, right? Isn't that the way we often tell the Jewish story? Like, Abraham discovered that there was one God, and then, for the rest of our history, we've been, railing against all of these false idols. Okay, but remember, that isn't exactly how it worked. It's not like Abraham suddenly started the Jewish religion. The Jewish religion, as a whole religion that we think of it today, doesn't start until Moses, and so Moses is the one that gets all these actual laws. Okay, so when Moses gets the laws, what's the situation in the world? And this is how Maimonides makes his case. The custom back then, Vaya minhag hamufursan ba'olam, the famous custom in the world, the general custom in the world in those days, and the general mode of worship in which Israelites were brought up. It's just the world they lived in, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow down before those images and to burn incense before them. Religious and ascetic persons were in those days the persons that were devoted to the service in the temples erected to the stars, as has been explained by us. In other words, I've told you about this before. Back in the day, there were temples and they worshipped planets and stars and the sun and the moon and all kinds of non-monotheistic things. Okay. It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, as displayed in the whole creation, that God did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these manners of service, for to obey such a commandment, it would have been contrary to the nature of man, of human, who generally cleaves to that to which he is used, that which he is used to. It would in those days have made the same impression as a prophet would make at the present. Okay, wait, hold on. Okay, I don't want to continue too much more. Let's just there's a whole, he makes several points and there's a whole big chunk of text, so let's not get lost, or let me not get you lost. Let's just start with that first premise, and what a premise. And let's talk about it for a minute. What do we agree with Maimonides, who now you have the gist of the argument. You can't ask people who only know sacrificial worship. That was the way of the world. You cannot ask people to suddenly start just to just give it all up. You just can't do that, because that would be too abrupt for them. They just wouldn't be able to go from one extreme to the other. So as a general principle, I'm curious if that makes sense to you. Do you think that it's true that if sacrifice is the way of the world, it's going to be pretty hard to command people not to offer sacrifices? And why is that? I mean, I sit here and I think, is it that big a deal? They're being asked to do a lot of different things, to leave Egypt, to worship this new God. So, I mean, what's the big deal? All right, let's hear from Samuel Friedman.
Hi there. So in terms of, what's it take to change, one's mindset here, it's like, yes, we're all been sacrificing all these animals, possibly for generations here. I also ask, where and when was this command given? Okay, the Jews / Israelites just left Egypt. Were they doing all the animal sacrifice in Egypt? Okay, what's everybody else around them doing as well? And so it's clear to me that, they don't necessarily have the background of, sacrificing animals in a Jewish context, because, they're just starting off as Jews. But I also think that they can change, and people do occasionally change. I mean, if you look at Mount Sinai, what happens? We say, we're going to change what we're doing. And it happens in fairly short order. Okay, maybe not overnight, but within a year or so, it seems like they're following what Moses says.
That's right. Yeah, this is an interesting way to think about human nature, that it's hard for people to go from one thing to the other. Sure, but it's contradicted by some of the major arcs of the Torah's narrative. Isn't Sinai itself a radical transformation of an entire people? Aren't they going from not keeping Shabbat to keeping Shabbat? There's so many things that they're being asked to change, overnight. It's this strange, idea. And Maimonides, right at the start, he said many of our laws can be explained this way.
Not all of
Obviously,
them.
not all of them, right? Because like that. It doesn't. Not all of the laws are just a continuation of the way things used to be. And as Samuel says, the way things used to be, as Maimonides is narrating it, is what it was like in Egypt. So we just sort of imagine this is the land, the infrastructure, the landscape, the customs and ceremonies they're used to. And so, that's just the world they lived in, you know. But I mean, the whole point is they're leaving Egypt. That's the whole point, Egypt in particular. And yet Egypt's like sacrificial world is going to inform the Torah's own. Let me just say the thing here, which is so alarming to later commentators. There's something about this that suggests that the Torah isn't giving us the best system. The Torah is giving us what you call like a b'di'evid, like a plan B, a kind of a concession. Okay, that's the main word here. The sacrifices are a concession to our nature, which is, first of all, rooted and grounded in whatever cultural context we're in, and second of all, finds it very difficult to make major transformations. Samuel says, I don't know. I see some major transformations in the Torah. So why is this the one place where you come and you say, oh no, they needed to evolve, and so take it little by little. All right, let's hear from a couple of other thinkers, and then we'll head back to Maimonides. Let's hear from Matt Silverstein.
I've said this line before. I'm going to say it again. Fraser, Golden Bough, gives the line that ritual survives. I don't remember his wording, but ritual survives far longer than theology. Mm-hmm. Bullfighting is 4,000 years old. It was a Mycenaean religious rite, and the Pope is the pontiff because that's the Pontificus Maximus, who is the priest of the bridges of Rome. And so they kept the title. We keep ritual. We find another thing for it to mean. And Jews do that. And in fact, I want to say is an essential Jewish thing, because long before I read Fraser, I did, what does this mean to me today? What is this about? It's not just the Seder, but we're always saying, I'm going to do this thing. Sacrifice the animal, eat the matzah, do the whatever, and I'm going to find some other thing that it means.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's a very what Matt is saying here, I think is quite profound, because I feel it myself, that we are just to restate some in a basic way, somewhere Matt started, that we are in some ways more attached to the rituals and the features and forms in our tradition than we are to the ideas. And by attached, I mean it's harder for us to let go of our customs and practices. And he uses that word. Maimonides used it, at least, I don't know, he wrote in Judeo-Arabic, so neither of these translations neither of these is the original. But the word in the Hebrew that they're using is minhag, a custom. Those customs, those things that are just sort of the ways that we practice our behavior, is hard to break, and maybe not our ideas. And that's, I think that's it's quite a profound thing to say, that Matt's saying in the name of Fraser. But I know it to be true. I mean, I have all kinds of like prayers, ways of praying that I grew up with, little customs like that are grounded in, things that I'm not so sure that what's a good example? I'm very particular to put on my shoes, right shoe, left shoe, tie left, tie right. There's all kinds of like seemingly like folk traditions that turned into Jewish like laws, of like, avoiding the eyes of the Satan, or, like things that I don't like. You asked me what I really think my theology. This seems like that I don't really, but I've been doing it since I was like a kid, and I want to do, because it's just so in me. It's so deep in me. I want to, like, yeah, they're just like there are things that I am attached to because that's the way we used to do it. And I can't I can't do otherwise. Okay. I'm that much I relate to. And I want to just give my like, now that Matt has framed it in this way, I want to just like give the sort of second half of Maimonides' thought here. And we're going to skip a little and come back, because what we've said so far is it's impossible for a person to leave behind the practices that they know, and to go to the other extreme. So what is the answer then? What does Maimonides say? I'm going to come back here because he said something really interesting here, but I think it's like the next step. I just want to finish this thought, which is, for this reason, God allowed these kinds of services to continue. I think that's a typo. Services to continue. God transferred. This is like really interesting language here. God transferred the God's service. Sorry, God transferred to God's service that which had formerly served as a worship of created beings, like the sun. The sun was created, but you used to worship the sun with sacrifices. God transferred that kind of worship of things imaginary and unreal and commanded us to serve God in the same manner. That is, to build unto God a temple, make me a sanctuary, have the altar erected to God's name, to offer sacrifices to God, to bow down before God. Okay? The priests who serve in the temple, well, there used to be priests, and there used to be donations to the priests. All of these things, all of Leviticus, the whole thing, which seems to us, what do the academics call it? The sacrificial cult. When you read academic books, you ever come across this, like, oh, we have to discuss the sacrificial cult. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not in a cult, am I? What are you using that word? And I'm sure they're using it for, precise academic reasons, but it's like, it does feel that way. Like the priests and the donations and all of this, like, feels very, and especially if you're Maimonides, a real rationalist who believes that like the true God experience happens in the mind, all of this seems like just, barbaric, like ancient, and it looks a lot like idolatry. But he's saying, no, but that's the point. You took your idolatry and you just moved it over to God. Okay, like, very huge radical thing for Maimonides to say, and Matt has given us some way of appreciating, some logic for appreciating that. Like, we needed to do the thing, we're attached to the thing. To redirect the idea behind it, that we can do. That's easier, actually, for a person to do than to change the behaviors that they're so used to. Okay, interesting. David Kurtz.
I am so happy to be so in sync with Maimonides. I had no idea. Rework the genius of Torah is certainly in Genesis. It's a reworking of mythologies that were already there, put in a redirected and put in a context that's totally different to this story. No, almost any story in Genesis is not an original story, the most famous being not only creation, but certainly flood stories, which were everywhere in the world. But when you recontextualize it and work that mythology towards a certain point, it's not till we get to Exodus that we're totally in original territory here. I've always looked at, talking about sacrifice, throughout the ancient Near East, and I think in Egypt too, there was child sacrifice. And I've always read the Akedah as a repudiation of child sacrifice. And what ends up being sacrificed? The ram. So, I'm just so smiling to be so in sync with Maimonides. Thank you.
Great. Okay, good. Right. So David's in sync with Maimonides, and I'm glad to hear it, because this is like a whole school of thought. I mean, that's part of what I want to I wanted to talk about this because it's a very important piece, and it's always difficult for us to think about the sacrifices. This is one of the classic resources for, for us to think about the sacrifices, but it is a radical position. It's a radical position, and I'll show you what a radical position is by giving you a I want to give you the other voice in the tradition. The other voice, which belongs to Nachmanides in this case, and these two are often going at it. In fact, I think in Lech Lecha this year, we did another debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides. They're always fun to track. And Maimonides is in some ways the greater of the two. I mean, Nachmanides is commenting on his work. But Nachmanides is like, in some ways, the more traditional, the more hardcore of the two, and is going to, in his way, and we're not going to go through a lot. I just want to, all I want you to hear is the tone of his response. He's got his own explanation for the sacrifices, which we don't really need to study today. He's got, the hidden mysteries within the sacrifices and all the reasons, and they're, but listen to the language he uses before he introduces his own theory, just to hear Nachmanides here. Nachmanides says, oh boy, here we go. Okay. Vehinehem divrei havai. These words are preposterous. Havai is like worthless, empty, frivolous, stupid. These you don't say that to Maimonides, okay? You don't say that to but he does if you're Nachmanides' view. Vehen divrei havai. These are preposterous. They attempt to heal a great fracture and answer a major question with a superficial answer. In other words, I admit that the problem is significant. Okay, this is a really important phrase here, because Nachmanides is also saying, I get it. It's hard for us to understand the sacrifices. It's a major question, but you're giving me a silly answer. You're giving me a silly answer, and you are making the table of the eternal, and there was a table in the tabernacle. So, but the table of the eternal in this case is the altar. You are making the table of the eternal a disgusting thing. This is goel nefesh. You're making it a disgusting thing. It's only there to deal with the hearts of the wicked and the fools of the world. Okay. I want you to just hear the response here, and now we're in a very major Jewish debate, and I wonder what side you will take. David Kurtz has taken Maimonides' side, but does anyone take Nachmanides' side? Like, what are you doing to our Torah here? It's all just like, well, you know how people are. They need to do idolatry, and we're just going to let the people do idolatry for as long as they need to, because what are you going to do? That's what it is. And we're actually doing an idolatrous act when we worship our God. This is actually base, low-level, ancient, archaic. Why would the Torah do that? This is the Torah. This is the word of God. Don't tell me that the sacrifices are just a concession. Nothing in the Torah is a concession. Okay, so now you see the debate here, and I see a lot of hands. So let's process it a little bit. But those are the stakes here. Is the Torah just a disgusting reenactment of stupid, foolish, wicked people's desires, or is the Torah brilliantly dealing with the resistance that human beings have to change and sort of moving us slowly towards at least redirecting our wicked actions? Where we go from there is the next question, but let's just hover in that debate. All right, let's hear from Regina.
So I think that one of the points of bringing the sacrifices was to bring your best to God, your best of your flocks, the best of your produce to God, and then it also served to feed the Levites and the Kohanim. So I really see any problem with it there. And quite frankly, sure, I don't like animal sacrifice anymore in our day, but look at what we do. We give our money to the synagogue. The synagogue pays the rabbi, the rabbi goes out and buys kosher meat, which is slaughtered in a kosher way, and has a barbecue. Tell me how that's different.
I love that. I love that, Regina. Thank you. I love all of that. First of all, we'll get to the meat that we eat today, because that's a brilliant point. But let's just start where you started, which is to say, come on, you don't understand what the sacrifices are doing in the Torah? You're giving to God. Like, you're sacrificing to God. And it's a tribute, and it's clearly, it's not a mystery why all this is happening, and it's not such a strange thing, like, to say, yeah, don't serve foreign gods, serve me instead. And this was the form of worship, so that's all there is to it. And maybe now we're in a different place, but that's not just because we're in a different place now. When we go back 2,000 years and say more than 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 3,500 years, and say, oh, how could this possibly be? That's the way it was. The revolution was directing it to God. Now, so it's not so hard. It's not so hard, really, to figure out why there are sacrifices there. And then Regina says, and I love this because it's a perfect analogy. What about and I didn't think you were going here, Regina. What about our system, which also has a rabbi or a priest or a prayer leader representing the community, and we, all pitch in to pay their salary. Thanks, everybody. And it's like, don't we do much? Like, what are our tefillot? Are we really communing with God, or is it just our version of doing the same thing? And it's all kinds of rituals. And the reason that I appreciate what Regina said is especially that last bit where she said, and we eat meat. We make a barbecue. Is that we're so advanced now, and we can't possibly think, oh, how could we ever kill these animals? But most of us still eat meat. Now, this is a very important point, because eating meat is, in fact, another concession that the Torah makes. So this is a little bit like Regina's made such a good point, but in a way, I could respond by saying, yes, that's true, Regina, but there's another example of a concession that we should try to eventually get past. So when did we start? We were not allowed to eat meat when we were little frolicking naked beings in the Garden of Eden. It was only after Noah saved all the animals. Do you remember this? This is the next source on our sheet. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. As with the green grasses, I give you all these, but you must not eat the flesh with its lifeblood in it. And that is generally understood to be a gift or kind of concession that God gave to Noah, because now the world is devastated. It's going to be, how is he going to feed himself after? And he saved all the animals, so he gets to eat animals. But many in our tradition think that this was not the ideal, that we were not supposed to eat meat, that we were supposed to, ideally, live like Adam and Eve and just pluck fruit off of trees. Not the wrong trees, but, fruit off of trees. Rav Kook, famously, the first chief rabbi of Israel, believed that the Torah's ideal was vegetarianism, and that our ability to eat meat was a concession, again, to human nature, right? So that's another example. And I'll give you a couple more. We're just like, while we're in this line of thinking, let me give you a couple more, because what we have here is a theory of the Torah, which is that the Torah can sometimes give us a law that the Torah, God, Moses, doesn't actually esteem, it doesn't actually hold as an ideal, but the Torah and God and Moses understand that we just need this right now. So here's another example of a concession. I just want to give two more, and the last one is really disturbing. So I'm warning you, before we get there, that the last one deals with, war and rape and terrible things. So prepare yourself. But before that, this one's also disturbing, but less viscerally so. What about the cities of refuge? Okay, the cities of refuge were a place where you went if you accidentally killed someone, and you're the family of the person you accidentally killed, manslaughter, was wanted to avenge the death of their relative. So you could flee to a city. The assembly shall protect the killer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled, and there he shall remain until the death of the high priest who is anointed with the sacred oil. Okay, he's safe in this city. But if the killer ever goes outside the limits of the city of refuge to which he has fled, and the blood avenger, the relative, comes upon him outside the limits of the city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the killer, there's no blood guilt on his account, meaning he goes free. If you killed accidentally my sister, then I'm mad at you and I'm going to come kill you, but you didn't mean to do it. So the Torah understands and lets you run to the city of refuge. But if you leave the city of refuge, I'm allowed to kill you. Why? Why didn't the Torah just say, it's an accident, you can't kill people when it's an accident? But instead the Torah understood, I'm so enraged, I can't stop myself. You killed my relative. Now, we can put you in a safe place and then I'm not allowed to touch you. But if you don't abide by this concession, then I will not be held responsible because that's just the way it is. The Torah can't command me not to feel that sense of revenge. Okay? Is that true? Is that true? Okay, let me give you just the last example. And this one really is the most difficult, but it's a classic. And I give it to you in part because of our conversation, because our rabbis did not accept that this could be an ideal commandment, but it's the commandment of the woman of beautiful form, Eshet Yafat Toar, when you go out to war and you take captives, and one of your captives is a woman that you're attracted to, okay? Like really, you know what comes next, really horrifying situation here. And the response that the Torah gives also seems horrifying, which is that when you go out and take the field against your enemies and God delivers them into your power and you take some of them captives and you see among the captives a woman and you desire her and would take her into your household as your wife. Wife is really not the right word. You would take her as a captive. You like her, you're gonna take a woman for yourself from the spoils of war. Well, here's what the Torah commands. You shall bring her into your household and she shall trim her hair, pare her nails, and discard her captive's garb. She shall spend a month's time in your household lamenting her father and mother, meaning that she's no longer with. And after that, you may come to her and thus become her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you don't want her anymore after the 30-day period, you must release her outright. You can't sell her because you took her. You can't turn her into a slave. Now, that is not the most inspiring law. Oh, that's so nice. You can't sell her. You could get rid of her if you want. It's like the whole thing is horrifying. But our rabbis understood this to be another example, and Rashi gives the famous commentary on it. And this is like in the Maimonides school of thought here. The Torah, lo dibra Torah ela kneged yetzer hara. The Torah is only speaking, that is, makes this concession, only in view of man's evil inclination. For if the Holy Blessed One did not permit her to him as a wife, he would nevertheless, really marry is the wrong word here, but he would take her even though she would be forbidden to him. Okay, so that's another classic example of, and I am so aware of how charged this case is, so I speak delicately here and not to like polemicize in any way, but the Torah, at least as Rashi is understanding it, seems to be saying when men go to war, and I guess it's men they're thinking of, something is unleashed and they act in terrible and savage ways. And it's impossible to stop that. If you just told them to behave and be ethical, that wouldn't work. So instead, the Torah says, here's what you can do. You just hold on for 1 second, take her into your house and go through these, and then you can have her. And that somehow is enough that a person would say, okay, I'll take her later. And then the Torah, this is a crazy thing to say, just like what Maimonides has said is a crazy thing to say about the Torah. The Torah hopes and expects that you will let her go. But it allows you to keep her so that, as a concession to your nature. Okay, I warned you, a really horrifying case. But all of these cases, the woman of beautiful form, the avenger of blood, the eating of meat and maybe the sacrifices themselves, all that we're developing. Maimonides said this. Lots of our laws might be ways that the Torah is saying, well, look, human beings, what are you going to do with them? They can't act right. So let's deal with them as they are. Let's try to encourage them to be better bit by bit, step by step. Okay. So now I'm going to turn back to you and see now we've got a bunch of test cases. What do you think of this theory that the Torah could be working in this way? Hiro.
I want to go back to sacrifices. Cain and Abel offered sacrifices. I mean, that goes back way before the rest of civilization. So I'm one of these people that I want to see sacrifices again.
Baruch shekivanta, as they say. Blessed are you that your mind went in this way, because that is exactly where Nachmanides goes. I mean, what you say, you would get a gold star in yeshiva today, Hiro, because like when you say something that is like what the Rishonim said, like I always chuckle at this, that like, you know, as in university, the thing is to say something that no one's ever said before. That makes you a genius. But when you're in yeshiva, if you say something that someone said before, oh, you're a genius. You got it. So Hiro just did that. And this is exactly where Nachmanides, I just gave you his little polemicizing, like, this is BS, I don't, no way. But he goes on, and one of the main points he makes is, what do you mean it's just there to combat idolatry? Hiro cites Cain and Abel, and Nachmanides cites Noah. Noah offered a sacrifice to God. Noah wasn't an idol worshiper. Now, how would we respond to that? I don't know, like I might say, well, yeah, but it was a more primitive time, so maybe that's proof for the case. But Hiro's point is very strong. If the whole thing is just there to deal with our unfortunate immersion in Egyptian idolatrous culture, how do you explain Cain and Abel? How do you explain Noah? How do you Abraham made sacrifices, Jacob made sacrifices, lots of people make sacrifices, so this theory actually doesn't make sense at all, right? Unless you say, oh, well, that was a different time. But Hiro's got a strong point here. All right, let's hear from Yonatan.
Going back to what David Kurtz said, it's undeniable that the Torah is mapping itself onto the world. The world also maps itself onto the Torah. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai tells us that God looked into the Torah and created the world. So if we're going to have sacrifices that we derive from the Egyptian system, God first had to create the Egyptian system that offered sacrifices. Otherwise, the Torah doesn't work, right? And in that sense, Nachmanides and Maimonides are actually quite compatible. And they're compatible in that the Torah is a moral floor rather than a moral ceiling. It tells you, like the example that you gave, how to take a woman captive in battle, which is obviously something you shouldn't do. The Torah also tells us how to own slaves. I don't think the Torah tells us that we should own slaves. It's just that there's a set of principles that are like, you should not go any lower than this. You should probably go considerably higher than this. There are many things in the Torah we don't practice anymore, some of them by force of circumstance, and some of them because we know better. That doesn't mean we don't study them. I mean, we're doing it right now and we're learning from them. I would say, in the city of sanctuary, even though we don't have cities of sanctuary anymore, to me is like such a compelling construct that completely avoided the need for incarceration in ancient Israel. Like, yeah, okay, so we had this implication that people should be able to kill other people over accidental deaths, but we didn't have any prisons at all because we had these alternative options. And in many ways, I think we've gone below that moral floor. So I do think there's a deep lesson here to be learned. And just because we don't offer the sacrifices anymore doesn't mean we can't glean the wisdom from them.
This is great. Yonatan is really offering us a really robust theory of Torah here. And in a way, Yonatan picks up on David Kurtz's thinking, but sort of takes the problem, from the other end. In other words, you can resonate with Maimonides because you too see us eventually aspiring past sacrifices and not being held back by, this ancient system, and it's an evolution, and you, like Maimonides, want to get to the peak of that evolution. Or you can take the problem from the other end, as Yonatan is doing, and saying, the Torah, yeah, aspiration is great, but the Torah is also setting a floor, a baseline that is a kind of a, what was your phrase, Yonatan? A moral floor?
A moral floor, not a
A
moral
moral
ceiling.
floor. That's a remarkable theory of Torah that, you know, the Torah wants, like, cannot expect us to be, and this really is like, what Yonatan is giving us here is a real, a deep understanding of what Maimonides is saying, a kind of sympathetic understanding, a sympathetic to Maimonides and also sympathetic to us, that it really is true that you can't expect people to act perfectly all the time. You just can't. But what you can do is insist that they not go beneath the moral floor, that they not act like monsters, that they not act like idolaters, they not act the word. That's all you can really expect. To treat your slaves nicely. Can the Torah come onto the scene and say, "Hey, world"? I mean, this is one of our, you name one of our. I should have mentioned this one also. So thank you for this example. The first law in Mishpatim is you have to let a slave go after 6 years. How about no slaves? Like, we just finished Hebrew. How about no slaves? But again, a lot of the commentaries are, well, you can't have no slaves in a world where people literally sell themselves into slavery to pay their debts off. Like, that's the world. What are you going to do? Okay, so I think we really have to take that seriously, what Yonatan is saying, and by extension, what Maimonides is saying. Like, the Torah's not there to make us angels. The Torah's there to set a moral floor. Okay, let's hear from Jen.
I mean, let's be real. The reason why we don't do temple sacrifices historically is because we don't have a temple. Like, it got destroyed. It's not because we as a people all like developed a strong sense of animal rights and decided we no longer wanted to kill creatures. So much of our moral development historically is because of economic contingencies, cultural interactions. Like, it's not necessarily a story of us all becoming more and more enlightened. And we lose so much when we look back on our ancestors with the attitude that we are doing it better and we are more enlightened than they were. There's slavery in the world. Until like a decade ago, we were getting diamonds from slaves in Africa, and many people still are. Our clothes come from practical slaves in China, in Bangladesh. Like, we are not better than our ancestors. And we are learning, if we pay attention from our ancestors, to relate to their striving for justice, even in those imperfections. Like, that's the piece that we can take out of this, is what were they doing within that context to move themselves toward justice? What was the spirit? What was the inspiration? And how did they use the language and tools of their time to do meaningful things that we can relate to? And I mean, this is an issue when we talk about like 18th century literature or reading Harry Potter or like all sorts of things, where do we take the art and beauty and wisdom from people who did problematic things? Or do we fixate on the problematic things and think that we're better?
This is great. This is like a whole, I mean, in some ways, Jen is kind of picking up on the themes that Yonatan was just working through. But in some ways, Jen offers us an entirely new theory here of Torah, which is to say that unlike Maimonides, let me put it the other way. Like Maimonides, Jen acknowledges that there are concessions to just the way things are, the way we are, the best of our ability to perceive. But unlike Maimonides, Jen doesn't necessarily see that as, and therefore, inevitable progress towards better and better and higher ideals. No, in fact, the Torah is telling us about human concession because we're all embedded in a social, cultural context. We're all limited by that. We all struggle. How do we worship now? And is this the highest form of worship? We were just trained to go into synagogues, and this is the way, and someone will come along and say, like, that's not the ideal form of worship. But we're all just in our cultural context, and the best. And I think what's particularly, I think, generous in what Jen is saying is that the best we can do is go back and try to understand why our people once related to sacrifices. And we can say we don't anymore, but that doesn't necessarily have to put them on a like backwards in the scale of progress and us forwards in the scale of process, in the scale of progress. I think that's I want to just really hold that as a possibility. That's a distinct theory. Having said that, I do want to end with, I want to go back to Maimonides and just end with, Maimonides looks at it differently than Jen, and Maimonides really does see us moving towards greater and greater spiritual evolution. And he said something, remember I skipped earlier. I want to just go back and say, the whole thing of giving sacrifices to people who were only used to sacrifices, he says, is because they couldn't have just been told, start praying. They weren't used to praying with words. And he gives an example here, and this I just want us to think about as we leave the class today. He says, it's like it was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God as displayed in the whole of creation, that God did not command us to give up and discontinue all these manners of service. Okay, that we know. For to obey such a commandment, it would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally cleaves to that to which he is used. We read that. Here's what we didn't read. It would in those days have made the same impression as a prophet would make at present if he called us to the servants of God and told us in God's name that we should not pray to God, nor fast, nor seek God's help in time of trouble, that we should serve God in thought and not by any action. Okay, that's a big thing for Maimonides to say. If someone came now and said, discontinue all your barbaric prayers, just meditate, just contemplate the oneness of God. Some of us might like that. I think Maimonides would have liked that. That's really where Maimonides sees us going. The ultimate is to leave this behind too, and to get to higher and higher and higher forms of worship. But if someone came today and say, shut down all your synagogues, I've got the perfect Jewish meditation for you, that wouldn't happen. We wouldn't do that. As we said earlier, we're attached to, as Matt said, we're attached to the forms. We want to go to shul. We're used to this now. And this becomes very relatable, but it also presents us with a very progressive vision of religious history, which is that we're moving towards some higher ideal, and we'll never go back. We'll never go back to the sacrifices, and then eventually we'll transcend this and we'll never go back. It's always progress, it's always higher. That's not a theory you have to buy, but I think it is embedded in Maimonides' philosophy and his philosophy of the Torah. So the debate continues, but I thank you all for your participation in it. Wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and I'll see you next week.